So next up, we have Anthony Deighton. Anthony Deighton, he has over 20 years of experience building and scaling enterprise software companies. Oop. My computer went down. There it goes. Currently, Anthony serves as an investor, advisor, and board member to startups around the world, including Grid.is, Cardo, Einblick.ai, Vislib UK, Miracle, Reniker, which was recently sold to Brainshark. And he began his career in enterprise software with Siebel Systems, where he helped found the Employer Relationship Management business unit, and holds a bachelor's degree in math and economics from Northwestern University, and also an MBA with high distinctions from Harvard Business School. I'd like to everyone to welcome Anthony.
Thank you. And a clicker. And I got the COVID stick. So that's exciting. All right. So thank you for the introduction. So I really enjoyed today's presentations. It's been really nice to sort of step back a little bit and think about the citizen data science and scientists and sort of what we're trying to get done as an industry. In preparing for today's remarks, I'm not coming at this from the perspective of any particular vendor or any particular technology, but really wanted to sort of take an opportunity and step back and think about sort of the long arc of history and what's going on. And I'll also apologize ahead of time because this presentation is exceptionally opinionated, which is to say that you could reasonably disagree with almost anything, including the title, by the way, of the presentation. You could reasonably disagree with almost anything that I'm about to say. For me, partly thinking about this conference coming out of MIT, coming with a lot of academic credentials, and really looking forward to the next set of speakers after the coffee break from an academic perspective, really thinking about what's going on in the industry, and then as practitioners, what we should all be focused on. What are sort of the big problems we can focus on? So one of the things that wasn't mentioned in the introduction, the bulk of my professional experience has been at a company called Qlik, a data visualization and dashboarding company. I spent 12 years there, started at Qlik when it was a small, unknown Swedish software company. A lot of people don't even realize Qlik was founded in Sweden. I'm not Swedish, but and then we sort of built it into a global business. And the quote on the screen is a throwback to roughly 11 years ago, actually almost exactly at this time, when we took Qlik public on the NASDAQ. And so you can imagine this is an exciting time. We've been spending a lot of time building the business, and we sort of take the train to and from New York for a year, building and writing the S1, sort of go through the IPO process, a lot of fun, et cetera. And when we stand up on stage and we try to articulate what is it that Qlik does, why is it valuable and important, we put up this quote, data is the raw material of our time. So what I thought I might do in this presentation is unpack that statement a little bit. What do we mean when we say data is the raw material of our time, that we're sort of building a data business? And so at the risk of ruining the rest of my presentation, this is what I think we mean by that. The first is that we're right at the beginning of what I believe to be the fourth industrial revolution. And I've called it the insight revolution. We can have a healthy debate as to whether that's the right word for it. And I will also argue in this presentation that as an industry, we've significantly overinvested in the problem and opportunity that is data visualization. So this idea that data visualization is a kind of key and core platform technology for how we work with and understand data, we're sort of like way over-rotated towards that. And as a result, there remains a significant opportunity for everyone in this actual and virtual room, a significant opportunity to solve some really important problems that are going to drive the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years of this fourth industrial revolution. So with that as a backdrop, let's maybe step way back. Let's step back and ask the question, what were the first three industrial revolutions? And so if we're going to argue that we're at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, probably worth understanding at least a little bit about the first three. So I would argue the first three industrial revolutions are as follows. The first is the mechanized production industrial revolution. So the idea behind this is, as human beings, our physical ability to do work was limited by our literal muscles. And we invented a set of technology which mechanized production, which meant that we could leverage our own human strength and also things like steam power, water power, et cetera, to build machines which could do way more work than we could do individually. The second industrial revolution is the factory system revolution. And the idea behind this is that we took this mechanized production and we scaled it. And as many people in software engineering know, that just scaling something doesn't always work. Just adding more of it doesn't work. And so in a sense, the second industrial revolution was about the system, the factory system behind how you could take mechanized production and scale it much, much bigger, and Henry Ford's factory system, and there's a whole set of research here. And the third industrial revolution is the digitization of the digital content revolution. So if you think about it, in the first industrial revolution, the limiting factor is the human being. How much can I do, right? The second industrial revolution, the limiting factor is the system, right? How much can the factory produce? And in the third industrial revolution, being digital, there was no limit. We now have effectively infinite copies of any particular item. So there's an infinite capacity for delivering digital content. So these are the first three industrial revolutions. And so that is thinking a little bit about industrial revolutions in general and how they evolve. So as a business, what is the business of business? The business of business is taking a raw material, doing something to it, and then distributing it to people who presumably give you money in return for those goods and services. So we start with something raw, we transform it, and we distribute it. And in the context of the first industrial revolution, you can sort of think about it like this. So we start with cotton, a raw material. We then run it through a mechanized production system, the electric or the loom, and we produce textiles, which we then distribute with transatlantic shipping. And this is the foundation of that first industrial revolution. And one thing I think is really important is to think about how the industrial revolutions evolve over time. And perversely, they don't start with some major innovation in raw materials. It wasn't as though somebody sat down and figured out how to grow cotton much more effectively. In fact, what happens is they start with a disruption in distribution. So it's the invention of transatlantic shipping that drives the first industrial revolution. So all of a sudden, access to inexpensive cotton and the ability to distribute finished goods, finished textiles, literally globally, drives the need and desire to really innovate and create transformative technology in how we cotton into fabric and textiles. And that order of operations is a really important one. I just want to take a slight detour here for 1 second, which is clearly I'm not a historian. And secondly, I also want to be really careful that revolutions by their nature are not bloodless. And so we can, there's a huge subtext to the first and second and third industrial revolution. And it's very clear that the impact of the global cotton trade and global shipping on everyone's human life is highly controversial, and I'm not making a comment on that at all. The only point I'm trying to get across is this idea that the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the driver of this Industrial Revolution is a distribution disruption and not a raw material disruption. So, so we can apply this logic across each of the last three industrial revolutions. So we start with mechanized production, and it's a revolution in global distribution, global transatlantic shipping. We look at the factory revolution. I would argue that the transatlantic railroad, if you could invent the transatlantic railroad, do that. The transcontinental railroad that drove a lot of the factory revolution, because it allowed for local distribution of really heavy items, large items. That and later the automobile were really big drivers. That was the distribution disruptions that drove the factory revolution. And then sort of much more close to everyone's heart and arguably much easier to remember is the digital content industrial revolution was driven by ARPANET, was driven by the transformation in the distribution of digital technology. So now all of a sudden it was possible to be able to download something from around the world across a global internet, right? And so the invention of the internet is what drives this new content revolution in the third industrial revolution. So with that as a backdrop, a couple of sort of kind of key points that we can make at this point. First is my first assertion, which is that industrial revolutions are driven by innovation in distribution. So the radical simplification and cost reduction in distribution networks is what drives innovation in transformation technology. And that leads us to two important corollaries. The first is real value. Big sustainable organizations, industry-changing organizations come in innovation in transformation technology and not distribution technology. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean, inventing the transcontinental railroad is going to make you poor, right? By the way, if you can figure that out, absolutely do it. It's a great business. But that we're not going to see the flourishing of hundreds or thousands of railroads or hundreds or thousands of companies that are doing transatlantic shipping or many different internets. In fact, there's quite the opposite. Corollary 2 tells us that, so corollary 2 tells us that there's a tendency for distribution transformation or distribution disruption tend to accrue to a small number of almost like monopolistic vendors. And one really good example of that people may be familiar with is in fact the invention of the internet. So we don't have hundreds or thousands of internet service providers. The early innovators here, I use the example of MCI, mostly because almost nobody's heard of MCI anymore, now owned by Verizon and in between that owned by WorldCom. It's a perfect example of an early innovator in building out the internet. Almost all internet traffic, especially in the US, runs through what we would MCI networks, but is not Amazon, Google, and all of the content innovators that we think of as internet disruptors. So these things, we tend to see innovation in distribution. We tend to see that as a highly centralized and almost monopolistic outcome. Just as a slight side note, if you look at MCI, they're not stupid. They saw this as well. MCI tried to get into the content business. They actually started a service called, it was like 1-800-GOT-MUSIC or Get Music or something like that, probably an early precursor to YouTube or something like that, but weren't able to see that innovation through. So, and again, no harm, no shame in creating MCI, but if you look at the value creation that's occurred in content creation on the internet versus the distribution network, it's 10 to 1 or 100 to 1. And so much better place for us to focus. All right, so that's the quick tour through the first 3 industrial revolutions. Begs the question, let's talk a little bit about the 4th industrial revolution. What is that, and what's our shared opportunity as a community? So in some ways, we already gave it away at the top of the show. It's data is the raw material of our time. it's not oil, it's data. So we sort of acknowledge that the foundation of the fourth industrial revolution is the data that we generate as businesses. And in a sense, this morning, the presentations before this have all been about this foundational raw material that sits at the sort of cornerstone of every business, which is the data. I often like to say that every business is a data business. Many people think that they are in some other kind of business. They might think they're in the retail business or in the car making business or in the airline business. They're not. Every business is a data business. And if you either work for or you think about a business and you're not considering it as a data business, then you're running the risk of being obsolete. So we can all acknowledge that the raw material is the data, but it begs the question, what's going on the distribution and transformation technology side? So a little bit of a detour for a second on data. And this was mentioned actually a couple of times in a couple of the earlier presentations, both from Airbyte, I think the Tamer presentation mentioned this as well, that I would argue that data, the data war is over. So especially those of us who spent some time over the last many years in this industry, there's been a lot of fighting about how do I store, manage, and process data? Do I do that in Cloudera? Do I stand up my own data warehouse? Do I go procure servers? Do I do with HP Vertica? Like, what's the technology I should use to manage this vast resource of data? And I would argue that those debates are done, finished, and over. The answer is we store data in the cloud, and any organization that doesn't think they're storing data in the cloud is badly out of date and will be storing data in the cloud shortly. So the party's over, and you're going to put your data in one, if not all of the cloud data providers. So you can pick from your favorite cloud. I have no particular opinion on which one's the best, or Snowflake or Databricks. And very likely, by the way, there will be some consolidation in this space as well. So, I have no inside knowledge of what that consolidation may be, but I expect that you should expect that. So the data war is over. So in terms of the distribution revolution, this is, as the title of the presentation suggested, I argue that the dashboard is the revolution in how we distribute data to end users. So what built Qlik and Tableau and Power BI and Domo and fill in the blank with your favorite visualization and dashboarding tool is a radical transformation in the cost and efficiency with which we can distribute data to consumption endpoints, to end users. So today, the ability for end users to get access to data and to have bar charts and line charts on that data is just radically different than what it was 20 years ago when we were inventing this and people were building reports in Cognos or business objects. And so the dashboard is the distribution revolution that's powering the fourth industrial revolution. Whoops. But if you will bear with me, I will now rail on the dashboard through, I don't know, 7 or 8 slides. And you have to appreciate where this comes from. This definitely comes from a place of love. So I've spent, many years of my career, literally building dashboards, using dashboards, thinking about building dashboards, designing dashboards, and even building entire companies that do dashboards and visualization. And in fairness, I think visualization is an incredibly important foundational technology. In fact, I would argue that it is the foundational technology for the fourth industrial revolution. With that all said, there's some significant problems with visualizations and dashboards. And the first is that we're using it to solve every problem. So I can't tell you how many organizations I bump into, no matter what the business problem is, the answer is another dashboard. Oh, you have a churn problem. Let's build a dashboard for that. You want to know who your top customers are? Yeah, let's build a dashboard for that. And the result is just an incredible sea of dashboards that nobody can make sense of. They can't get access to them. They don't know which ones to go to. When they go to them, they don't have the right information. They're trying to piece the answer together through a sea of dashboards. That's partly because we framed the problem as a problem of data visualization. And so if everything you have, if the only thing you have is a nail, if all you have is a dashboarding tool, then by definition, you're going to solve that problem through another visualization. The second sort of major failure point of dashboards and visualization, I believe, is founded on a false premise. Edward Deming, I think he was the one who was sort of accused of this idea of what's measured is managed. I would sort of, in the spirit of being controversial, I would argue that this is probably one of the greatest lies told in management textbooks and management books. The idea here is that if I tell the sales team what their sales target is, that will cause them to achieve it. So I don't know anyone here who's run sales teams, but I would question how many times has that actually worked? We've created the sales dashboard. We've given people visibility into their sales performance, given them visibility into their target. We can even show them a beautiful gauge visualization that shows the gap between their current sales performance and their expected sales performance, and sales still don't improve, right? So this idea that what's measured is managed, I think is a sort of platitude that we tell ourselves as a way to make ourselves feel better, partly because it's much easier to do things like measure things than to actually improve them. But I think it's largely false. And partly it's built on another sort of falsehood, one that we see often in enterprise software, the if you build it, they will come falsehood, right? So this idea that if we just show people the data, if we build it and we show it to them, that they'll magically figure out how to take the right action. It's sort of embedded in people as some sort of known behavior for creating the right outcome. And so, the problem we need to do as citizen data scientists and practitioners is simply show them the information, build it, and they will do the right thing, they will come. So see it and they'll do the right thing, or build it and they will come. By the way, this is also a terrible way to build a software company, the if you build it, they will come strategy, one which we see repeatedly taken by startup after startup. So if you're doing a startup or you're thinking about doing a startup, if you build it, they will come as a really bad go-to-market strategy. I would suggest almost anything else, except maybe give it away for free, although that may in fact be better. The next challenge with dashboards is the bad data challenge. And I think partly because many of us as practitioners are sort of geeks by nature, technologists. We like to focus on the technology problem. And so we spend a lot of energy and time thinking about the big data problem. How do I manage it? How do I store it? How do I spin up servers? How do I orchestrate, et cetera, et cetera. When in fact, that's not the actual challenge. And I actually think over the course of today, if there was one sort of theme that came out repeatedly in the earlier presentations, it's this idea that the central challenge of the citizen data scientist is not how to manage gobs and gobs of data. It's how to deal with the fact that most of that data is meaningless, or at minimum is trapped in silos or trapped in different databases, trapped in different systems. And the central is how to get good data. It may not even be very large. It could be something you could manage on a laptop, but that's the actual central challenge that many actual organizations face. So dashboards by their nature tend to sort of worry about scale and performance and compute and how do I have these have really good response times, but miss the fact that actually under the covers the problem is no one actually trusts or believes any of the data. The next problem with dashboards is they confuse storytelling with truth. And I will have to admit that this one is very close to my heart. One of the sort of selling points that we used to tell a lot with Click was this idea that humans are natural born storytellers. And I happen to believe this is true. There's a sort of innate human capability to tell stories. And I think it literally goes back to our caveman origin, where we transmit important information through the narrative arc of a story. And that human capability has translated its way into data science, to our citizen data scientists, and into visualization and dashboarding. And it's often framed and articulated by the idea that the prettiest dashboard wins, right? So I have a really useful piece of information. I make the unfortunate choice of sharing it with you in text, and my competitor inside the organization has a stupid, uninsightful conclusion that they've drawn, and they put it together in a gorgeous, gorgeous visualization with 14 different colors, all branded, of course, to match the corporate identity. And it's just, and which one do the executives gravitate to? The pretty thing that tells the meaningless answer versus the important insight hidden in ASCII text, right? So this challenge that we, and in a weird way, dashboards only go to perpetuate this challenge. They sort of go in and they keep telling, look, it's what, it's the prettiness of the story that matters. It's your ability to tell the narrative arc. And as citizen data scientists, we fall victim to this, right? We lose sight of the challenge, which is to find meaningful insights in the data, and instead focus energy on formatting our reports. To continue down this road, what is the single most popular feature of every dashboard and BI tool in the market? Hint, it's on the slide. Export to Excel. Why is that? Why is it that export to Excel is the most popular feature in every dashboarding tool? It's because users are actually giving you really useful feedback. This is a pretty visualization, but it doesn't actually answer my question. If I could just get the data in a tool that I can control, Excel, I could answer the question I have, which is not answered by this dashboard. For the benefit of everyone in the room who's wondering what in the world the picture has to do with export to Excel, this is a statue in, I believe it's Madrid, which shows a fallen angel. Because I have a rule that I tell any software company that's building dashboards, which is that every time a user clicks export to Excel, an angel loses its wings. There's a different version of that, which is about puppies, but it's really dark, and so I don't try to use that in public. So angel losing its wings generally doesn't offend that many people, so that's a better one. But it's the right way to think about it. If you build an analytic tool and you have export to Excel as a feature, and somebody clicks on it, you failed. And as a citizen data scientist, if you develop an analysis and somebody clicks export to Excel, that means you failed. But it also highlights, I think, the central challenge of visualization, which is it's not answering people's questions. It's giving people a way to do cheap ETL and dumping data in Excel. Next, something we saw earlier in Phil's presentation from around Einblick, which I think is really interesting. Decision-making is inherently a collaborative process. It is by its nature something we do as a group. And in fact, I would argue that it's one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest challenges we've had over the last 18 to 24 months with the pandemic has been that doing this kind of work is significantly harder. And by their nature, dashboards are not collaborative tools. They're single user tools. And in fact, oftentimes inside dashboards, we go to great trouble to make sure that only I can see the data. I'm allowed to, these sorts of governance questions, put these artificial barriers in front of how people actually need to work with data and information for the purpose of decision making. So we've created these sort of single user tools for dashboards that don't work. I didn't realize that was a bill. Also, dashboards hide complexity. By their nature, the idea behind visualization and dashboard is to put a pretty front end on what is inherently a difficult problem. That doesn't really come through, but that's an ERD, a big enterprise. And the idea here is that enterprise data is inherently complex. Enterprise problems are inherently complex. Simplifying them to a gauge chart is unlikely to result in meaningful and important business decisions being made. And that is, in fact, the strategy that most citizen data scientists have, is to take complexity and reduce it to its most simple form, and I would argue, make it unusable. And last but not least, dashboards by their nature are a dead end for decisions. There's no action that comes from the dashboard. So the central challenge of many organizations isn't visualizing their data, it's how do you get people to do something, right? And that can be organizational, how do we make a decision? But it can also be very technical. How do I get people to enter orders correctly into SAP? How do I get things to ship on time? And this action orientation is missing from dashboards. That is my rant about dashboards, and take it again with a little bit of love, because I think that brings us to our shared opportunity as a community, which is, what are we really trying to do here? We can agree that the distribution, the dashboard problem is solved. So we now have the foundation of the fourth industrial revolution, but it begs the question, what do we put in that box? And so I would argue that what we are focused on is insights. I struggled a little bit with whether I should call those insights or AI, ML. Like, there's a lot of different words we use, but I actually, all things being equal, ended up liking this idea of insights best. That the goal we have in the fourth industrial revolution is to take this raw material of our time, data. Yes, we can distribute it through all of these wonderful visualization, dashboarding technologies, but that the energy and focus we need to have as a community is on making it significantly easier to get insights out of that data, to find meaning and truth embedded in that data. So I would argue that the fourth industrial revolution, built on data, is the insight industrial revolution. And we are right at the beginning of that. And, self-serving, but I would argue that started in 2010 when Click went public. You guys can decide if you want a different date, but I get to pick it. So that's my date. It leaves us with what is the work that we all get to do. I will admit that I am giving you a laundry list of problems and saying good luck and have fun. This, I would argue, is probably not an exhaustive list, but at least a good starting list of the set of challenges and problems that the world has in this fourth industrial revolution, in the insight revolution. And I would argue that it is what will power many of the great companies in the future. And but anyway, so very briefly, what are they? So number one is the focus on data quality. So again, a theme that we heard over the course of a number of different presentations this morning. There is a tremendous amount of work left to do to clean up enterprise data. I would argue we are in the early innings of that. I have yet to meet a company that says, yeah, no, we've got it nailed. We know who our customers are, where our suppliers are, where our parts are. If I ask any company how many employees they have, and if the number's bigger than one, they probably don't know. They're like, I don't know, we got like 3 or 5 or 100. I don't know. We got some employees. So even basic questions are not able to be answered. Second is we think of the challenge as being the data that I have in the data lake or in the Snowflake instance or whatever. As practitioners, we can bring data. Matt from Tamer articulated this as sometimes the best customer information isn't from your enterprise. You know less about your customers than Dun & Bradstreet knows or than ZoomInfo knows, right? And that is a very deep truth. I work with a company called Carto, which does geoanalytics. Location information is another great example. Like, it is not proprietary information to know the location of MIT, right? There's no competitive advantage in that, right? I should not need to go figure that out from first principles. That should just be something that my data product brings with it. Third is sort of the Einblick point, which is collaboration should be a first principle. So every tool that we do that works with data should by its nature imagine that more than one person are using it at the same time, and that their job is to work together to answer a business question. I think it was Phil who said Figma for data, but I think that's exactly the right way to think about this. By the way, the Figma analogy is a brilliant one, because what is Figma but design but collaborative, right? So they're applying collaborative technology to the problem of design. Well, we can do that for data. Vertical specific data applications. We have a tendency to think about data products as platform technologies. Data is a generic asset. It isn't. There are industry specific versions of it. Healthcare data is very different than automotive data, which is very different than government data. And we need to start acknowledging these differences in data, allowing us to build vertical specific applications. By the way, we've seen this story before. If you look at even any enterprise software space, the rise of the verticalized version of that. So if you take CRM, you had Salesforce, then you had Velocity, which was the verticalized version of Salesforce. And I mean, there are hundreds of examples of this. So not a big new idea, but not one we're seeing in data. So why do we have generic data integration platforms? We should have vertical specific ones. Next, the very controversial, I can't tell you how many times over the course of the day we've heard the word blah, 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 Python, blah, 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 code, or I'm going to solve that by doing more training. And just before I get filleted, I'm not saying don't write code and don't do training. Obviously, those are good things. The question we should be asking ourselves is, why did we need to train someone how to be a statistician in order to make basic business decisions? Why is it that someone needs to open Jupyter notebooks to do basic data analysis work? They shouldn't, right? And every time we see that, we should be looking at a business opportunity to think we could stop that. We can do better. Linking insight and action, sort of an obvious point, which is if the point of business is to do things, if all we're delivering is a bunch of insights, we're missing an opportunity to connect that to the work they're doing. I would point you to the success of companies like UiPath, which are really just macro building companies, being able to let people take actions quickly in the enterprise, as suggesting there's a big opportunity here. And last but not least is this idea about building on these cloud native data storage and calculation tools. Nobody should be building from first principles data storage technology. And if you are building data calculation technology, you better be really sure why what you're doing is very different than what I can get from BigQuery or from Azure or from fill in the blank Snowflake, whatever you want. And what I mean by this is, rather than trying to sort of compete with Google on BigQuery, or again, fill in the blank with your favorite, think about how you can add value on top of that platform. You're much more likely to result in a positive outcome. So these are the shared opportunity, the challenge that I think we face as an industry as we embark on building the fourth industrial revolution, the insight revolution. So I believe I'm out of time, and I'm more than happy to take questions or serve coffee, as the case may be.
One question we did get from the audience was it, as electrification is currently sort of the evolution of distribution for, say, goods and people, I guess, as you alluded to, what do you foresee as the evolution of distribution for dashboards?
So so the question is like, so I would argue that the revolution of dashboards is over. And again, being careful here. When people invented railroads, there's plenty of innovation that occurred in railroads after the 1800s, right? I mean, I just would argue that it was, on a relative to what we saw in industrialization, smaller, and it was centered on a small number of companies. So I am very confident that Tableau and Qlik and Power BI and Domo and many other data visualization companies have wonderful, long futures ahead of them. What I would argue is that no one in this room should try to create another one. Right? The ship, to overextend the analogy, the ship has sailed. No, I mean, like, the party's over. Like, we have some winners. I'm also happy to see and watch them fight it out. Tableau was already acquired by Salesforce. You don't want me to prognosticate about, what the future of data visualization is. What I'm telling you is this is not a good place to invest your scarce time, energy, and resources. That party is over. It was a great idea 20 years ago, probably even a great idea 10 years ago. It's not a good idea today. What is a good idea today is to focus on the insight box, right? And solve these problems. But if I find another way to build a bar chart on a line chart, right, we've got a problem.
Great talk. So do you have any thoughts on the fragmentation in the data space, given your comments, and how that will impede this fourth industrial revolution?
Yeah, so in terms of fragmentation, so just going back to the model for a minute, since as academics, I'm not an academic, by the way, we always have to go back to the model. So I expect to see significant consolidation in the visualization space. So much as we saw significant consolidation in the global shipping space and the railroad space, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how long that will take. It could be 30 years. That's fine. But so I wouldn't expect to see significant, or I would expect to see fewer companies owning the front end visualization. Quite the opposite. In the inside space, it's 1,000 flowers blooming. And that's true in the first three industrial revolutions as well. So, and by the way, I also think that's what makes it such a great opportunity for everyone in this room, which is that we don't have to try to compete to be the next data visualization company. Again, the ship sailed. Rather, there's significant opportunity to go build great and sustainable businesses on generating insights out of data. That is going to be a big space, and you're going to see, tens of thousands of companies and whole industries built on top of this point. And again, going back to corollary 2, corollary 1, which is we tend to see the disruption and the revolution from the front back, and so we tend to overinvest in the distribution innovation. I think everyone's creating railroads these days, so stop creating railroads and start thinking industry.
And we have time for one more question.
Thanks for, I think, a really provocative talk. I'm curious about why visualizations are just distribution. Why are they not why would we not consider them part of that transformation piece? Because I'm thinking about, who is producing the insight? Who is the insight useful for? What does it even mean to define what an insight is? And in my head, I would imagine a lot of that is happening through the medium of data visualization.
Sure. So part of my answer to that question is the visualization companies do it to themselves. So a lot of what we see in dashboarding and visualization tools, it goes back to this point about hiding complexity, that data visualization and dashboarding tools work to avoid putting complexity in front of the user, creating pretty pictures on top of data. In fact, if I'm really pejorative about it, I think a lot of what we've seen from the data science community when they use, I'm trying to be careful not to use vendor names, but when they use leading visualization tools is, how do I present this in a beautiful and compelling, simple way, right? How do I create a pretty picture on this? and not giving people a way to explore the data and to understand the complexity and generate their own insights and, and maybe disagree with me through this tool. It's quite the opposite. They're looking for ways to avoid debate and et cetera. Now, does that mean you couldn't create a really wonderful set of tooling which does have a compelling visual experience and allows you to generate insights from the data? Absolutely. I'm arguing that to some extent, that's not what we've as an industry focused on for the last 20 years with traditional visualization technologies. And I would further argue that the challenge of that is an insight challenge. It's not a visualization challenge. But in fairness, I also think that the current tooling, which is Python, Jupyter Notebooks, is also not that, right? We've made it far too inaccessible. So we need an opportunity to make it more accessible to more people, to give them access to the complexity which underlies the problem, and give them a metaphor mechanism of navigating and using it in a usable way. At the risk of sounding a little bit like a commercial, I think that the Einblick demo did a really good job of at least one framework for thinking about that. And certainly there are others, and it's not the only challenge, right? So there are also going to be people who invent new algorithms and new ways of looking at data and analyzing data. So, and again, the visual front end is important, but it's not the only thing. And I think as an industry, we've, as I've said earlier, over-rotated to think about the visual dimension, the visualization, the dashboard, the output, and not what insights am I actually generating or how to make it easy to create insights. Is that fair? All right, I know I'm over time. And I think our next is, well, I'll let you share the good news. What's next?
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony, for that thought-provoking presentation. Let's give it up for Anthony. Thank you.